Welcome to the Perspicacious Perspective. In this episode, I'll break down everything I think you need to know about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This conflict dates back for thousands of years, so I thought it would be worth providing you with everything you need to know to make an informed judgment. There are many historical events that have influenced the conflict, so I made my best effort to include them all, so you have full context of exactly what is going on there. So let's start from the very beginning. In 2000 BCE, or before Common Era, or before Christ, early Canaanite civilizations began to thrive in the region. Who were the Canaanites? The Canaanites were a Semitic people who lived in city-states across the region. What does Semitic refer to? Semitic actually describes a group of languages, including Hebrew and Arabic, as well as the people who traditionally speak them. While the word is often thought of as another term for Jewish, this is just one of a larger group of people who fall into the category. As well as Arabic and Hebrew, Semitic languages also include dozens of other ancient ones, including Phoenician and Aramaic, and modern languages such as Maltese. Where was this early Canaanite civilization region? Modern-day Canaan roughly corresponds to Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and parts of Jordan and Syria. It was a historical region in the Levant located along the eastern Mediterranean coast. Who inhabited Canaan? Canaan was home to various ancient peoples, including the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, who were descendants of Canaanites known for maritime trade, which is centered in modern-day Lebanon, the ancient Israelites, who appeared around 1200 BCE, the Philistines, who were non-Semitic people who settled in coastal Canaan, which is modern-day Gaza, the Amorites, Hittites, Jebusites, Hivites, and Perizzites, who were other ancient tribes mentioned in historical and biblical sources. When was the Kingdom of Israel and Judah established? The Kingdom of Israel and Judah was established around 1050 BCE, during the era of the biblical united monarchy under King Saul, who united the Israelite tribes, who was succeeded by King David and then King Solomon. In 1010 BCE, King David established Jerusalem as the capital. In 970 BCE, King Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem. In 930 BCE, after King Solomon's death, the kingdom splits into the Kingdom of Israel, which was the northern kingdom, whose capital was Samaria, and the Kingdom of Judah, which was the southern kingdom, whose capital was Jerusalem. So then, in 722 BCE, the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. Who were the Assyrians? The northern kingdom, also known as Israel, had been struggling with internal divisions and external threats, and the Assyrian Empire, under King Shalmaneser V and later his successor, Sargon II, ultimately defeated it. One of the most significant actions taken by the Assyrians was the deportation of a large portion of the Israeli population after the fall of Samaria. The northern kingdom of Israel was virtually destroyed. The Assyrians exiled much of the population, and the kingdom ceased to exist. The Assyrians employed a policy of forced relocation to prevent uprisings and to break the power of the conquered people. What happened to the Israelites? The Israelites were taken into exile, scattered across the Assyrian Empire, which included regions like Mesopotamia, Media, and Persia. This led to the loss of a distinct identity for these people, as they were assimilated into various other cultures and lost their separate national identity. The 10 tribes of Israel that were exiled are often referred to as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Over time, these tribes disappeared from historical records, giving rise to various legends and theories about their fate. What did the Assyrians do to replace the exiled Israelites and prevent further rebellion? The Assyrians brought people from other conquered regions to settle in the land of Israel. These settlers were known as the Samaritans, named after the capital city of Samaria. They blended with the remnants of the Israelite population and adopted a version of Israelite religion mixed with their own pagan beliefs. The blending of Israelite religion with foreign practices led to tensions between the Samaritans and the Jewish population in later centuries, as reflected in the New Testament and in Jewish historical accounts. With the fall of Samaria, the northern kingdom ceased to exist as an independent political entity. The southern kingdom of Judah remained intact for a time, but it too would later fall to the Babylonians. The Assyrians continued their dominance in the region for several decades until they were eventually overthrown by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. The Babylonians destroyed the first Jewish temple in Jerusalem and exiled many Jews. They exiled a significant portion of the Jewish population to Babylon, which is modern-day Iraq. The historical records estimate that around 10 to 20,000 Jews were forcibly exiled to Babylon. This is referred to as the first major Jewish diaspora. The event, known as the Babylonian exile, lasted until 539 BCE, when the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon and allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem. About 50,000 Jews returned under a Jewish leader. In 536 BCE, the Jews began the construction of the Second Temple. The temple was finished in 516 BCE under Persian rule and dedicated in Jerusalem. It became the center of Jewish worship for nearly 600 years until the Romans destroyed it in 70 CE, leading to the Great Jewish Diaspora. What was the Great Jewish Diaspora? The Great Jewish Diaspora refers to the hundreds of thousands of Jews who were killed or enslaved. Many fled to Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Emperor Hadrian banned Jews from Jerusalem after another failed Jewish revolt in 135 CE, and Judea was renamed Palestina to erase Jewish ties to the land. More Jews were exiled, marking the start of a larger global diaspora. What were the differences between the First and Second Temple? The First Temple was built by King Solomon in 957 BCE. It was lavish and richly decorated, but more importantly, it contained something called the Ark of the Covenant, which was lost after the Babylonian conquest. The Second Temple was built in 516 BCE. It was expanded by King Herod in 20 BCE, and it became the center of Jewish pilgrimage until its destruction in 70 CE by the Romans. The Second Jewish Temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Roman forces during the Jewish-Roman War. This happened in 70 CE, almost 300 years before the rise of the Byzantine Empire. When did the Byzantine Empire emerge? The Byzantine Empire emerged in the 4th century CE after the division of the Roman Empire. They inherited control over the eastern provinces, including Jerusalem. By this time, the Second Temple had already been in ruins for centuries. Under the Byzantine Empire, especially after Emperor Constantine I converted to Christianity in the early 4th century, Jerusalem became a major Christian center. Constantine and his mother, Helena, were instrumental in establishing Christian holy sites in Jerusalem, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was built over what was believed to be the site of Jesus' crucifixion and burial. The area where the Second Jewish Temple once stood, known as the Temple Mount, was largely neglected in the Byzantine period. While the Byzantines had significant influence in Jerusalem, they were not involved in the destruction of the Second Temple, as that had already occurred under Roman rule. When did the Islamic Caliphate take control of Palestine? When the Islamic Caliphate took control of Palestine after defeating the Byzantine Empire in the 7th century, it marked a significant turning point in the region's history. The Byzantine forces were defeated by the Rashidun Caliphate at a battle which took place in 636 CE. This victory ended Byzantine control over the Levant, including Palestine. Following the battle, Muslim forces began to advance into Palestine. The region, which had been part of the Byzantine Empire for centuries, was now gradually incorporated into the rapidly expanding Islamic Caliphate. How did the Islamic Caliphate treat Christians and Jews? One of the most significant moments was the peaceful surrender of Jerusalem in 637 CE. After a prolonged siege, the city's Christian inhabitants agreed to surrender to the Muslim forces under Caliph Umar, who personally entered the city and respected its Christian heritage. He even allowed the Christians to continue practicing their faith and safeguarded their religious sites. The Muslim conquerors implemented a policy of religious tolerance. Christians and Jews, both of whom were considered people of the book in Islam, were allowed to practice their faiths in exchange for paying the jizya tax, which was a tax levied on non-Muslims. With the fall of the Byzantines, Christian rule over the region ended, and Palestine became a part of the larger Islamic Empire, initially governed by the Rashidun Caliphate and later by the Umayyad and Abbasid Caliphates. The Christian population in Palestine continued to thrive, but over time, the proportion of Muslims in the region increased as more Arabs migrated to Palestine. The Jewish population had been reduced significantly under Byzantine rule, but under Muslim rule, they were allowed to return to Jerusalem and other areas where they were permitted to live freely, though often as a minority group. During the Umayyad period, Jerusalem became a significant center of Islamic culture. the Dome of the Rock became an important religious site for Muslims, which marked the region's cultural and religious transformation. The Islamic Caliphate's control of Palestine brought lasting political, cultural, and religious changes that shaped the region's future, which established Islam as the dominant faith and significantly altered the power dynamics in the area. What happened after the Islamic Caliphate took control of Palestine after defeating the Byzantines? From 1099 to 1291, European Christians launched a series of military campaigns known as the Crusades, which temporarily led to the establishment of Crusader states in Palestine. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule. In 1099, Crusaders captured Jerusalem, massacring many of its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants. They established the Kingdom of Jerusalem along with other Crusader states. The Crusaders, mostly European knights and nobles, ruled Palestine through a feudal system. They built castles and fortified cities to defend their territory. The Crusader states frequently faced resistance from Muslim forces, leading to ongoing conflicts. The Muslim leader Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, united Muslim forces and defeated the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin in year 1187. After this victory, Saladin retook Jerusalem, ending nearly 90 years of Crusader rule. This led to the Third Crusade from years 1189 to 1192, led by Richard the Lionheart of England, but the Crusaders failed to reclaim Jerusalem. Several more crusades were launched, but they failed to establish lasting Christian control over Palestine. The Mamluks, a powerful Muslim dynasty based in Egypt, gradually defeated the remaining Crusader strongholds. In 1291, the city of Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold, fell to the Mamluks, marking the end of Crusader rule in Palestine. How long did the Mamluks control Palestine? The Mamluks systematically destroyed Crusader fortresses and cities along the coast to prevent any future European invasions. They turned Palestine into a frontier province under strong military control. Palestine was an important crossroads for trade routes between Egypt, Syria, and Arabia. Cities like Jerusalem, Gaza, and Nablus became commercial hubs. The Mamluks restored and renovated Islamic holy sites in Jerusalem, including the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. They encouraged Islamic scholarship and built Islamic schools. By the early 1500s, the Mamluks were weakened by internal struggles and conflicts with the rising Ottoman Empire. In years 1516 to 1517, the Ottoman Sultan Selim I defeated the Mamluks, and Palestine became part of the Ottoman Empire for the next 400 years. What was Palestine like under Ottoman rule? The Ottomans, as Sunni Muslims, continued to develop Islamic religious institutions and maintained the Hajj pilgrimage routes. Jerusalem became an important religious and cultural centre. Christians and Jews were allowed to practice their faith under the millet system, which granted religious communities a degree of self-rule. Palestine was an important trade route connecting Egypt, Syria, and Arabia. By the 18th century, Ottoman control weakened and European influence increased as France and Britain expanded trade and missionary activities. The Ottomans introduced modernization reforms, including land reforms that encouraged private land ownership. European Jews began immigrating to Palestine in the late 19th century, leading to tensions over land ownership. The Suez Canal from year 1869 increased Palestine's importance as a strategic territory. During World War I, the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany and the Central Powers. In 1917, the British Army captured Jerusalem from the Ottomans, and the British Mandate of Palestine replaced Ottoman rule after the war. In the late 1800s, the European Zionist movement grew. What is Zionism? Zionism is a nationalistic and political movement that supports the establishment and maintenance of a Jewish homeland, primarily in the historic land of Israel. The movement emerged in the late 19th century in response to European anti-Semitism and the desire for Jewish self-determination. The primary goal is to establish a sovereign Jewish state. There are different forms of Zionism, including secular, religious, socialist, and revisionist versions. It's a highly debated topic. Supporters see it as a legitimate movement for Jewish self-determination, while critics argue it has led to the displacement and suffering of many Palestinians. In years 1882 to 1903, there was a wave of Jewish immigration to Palestine from Eastern Europe called the First Aliyah. The First Aliyah was the first major wave of Jewish immigration to Ottoman-controlled Palestine, primarily from Eastern Europe, particularly Russia and Romania. This migration was driven by rising anti-Semitism, pogroms, which is the organised persecution of Jews, and economic hardship, as well as the Zionist movement's call for a Jewish homeland. In 1915 and 1916, the McMahon-Hussein correspondence was when Britain promised Arabs independence if they revolted against the Ottomans. The McMahon-Hussein correspondence is viewed by Arabs as a broken promise. However, Britain argues that the letters were deliberately vague on Palestine. In 1916, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was a secret British-French deal dividing the Middle East, contradicting promises to Arabs. It was a secret diplomatic deal between the British and French governments during World War I, which outlined how they would divide the Ottoman Empire's territory in the Middle East if they defeated the Ottomans. At the time, Britain and France were seeking to secure their own spheres of influence in the Middle East and maintain control over key regions like oil fields and trade routes. The agreement carved up the region into British and French-controlled areas. The consequences of the Sykes-Picot Agreement sowed seeds of resentment in the Arab world, as it became clear that the Western powers had little regard for the self-determination of Arab people. The agreement is often cited as one of the key factors that contributed to the instability and conflict in the Middle East throughout the 20th century. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration was a significant statement by the British government that supported the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. The declaration was made in a letter from British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to Lord Rothschild, who was a prominent leader of the British Jewish community, on the 2nd of November in 1917. In the letter, Arthur Balfour wrote, "His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object." The declaration was a formal endorsement by Britain of the idea that Jewish people should have a homeland in Palestine. However, it didn't specify what form the national home would take, nor did it clarify the rights of the existing Arab population in Palestine. It simply promised to facilitate the establishment of a Jewish homeland, but left many questions unanswered about what that would mean for the Arab majority living there. For many Jews, the Balfour Declaration was a significant victory. It was a major step forward in the Zionist movement and increased the legitimacy of their aspirations for a homeland in Palestine. The declaration was a key moment in the eventual establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. What happened when Britain took control of Palestine after defeating the Ottomans in World War I? Between 1918 and 1920, following the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, Britain took control of Palestine as part of the post-war restructuring of the Middle East. This period marked the beginning of British colonial rule over the region under the framework of a League of Nations mandate. By the end of World War I in 1918, the Ottoman Empire was defeated. The empire disintegrated and its territories were divided among the victorious Allied powers. In 1917, British forces had already begun to push Ottoman forces out of Palestine. After the Ottomans retreated, the British Army took control of Jerusalem in December 1917 and later other key cities in the region. After the war, the Allies met at the Paris Peace Conference to determine the fate of the former Ottoman lands. During this time, the British secured a mandate over Palestine through the League of Nations. This mandate gave Britain administrative control over Palestine and recognised its responsibility to implement the Balfour Declaration. What was the Balfour Declaration? In April 1920, the Allied powers formalised Britain's mandate over Palestine at the San Remo Conference, which was held in Italy. The conference ratified the Balfour Declaration and endorsed Britain's role in administering Palestine, officially placing it under British control. From 1918 until the official start of the mandate in 1920, British forces continued to administer Palestine in a military capacity. Following the Balfour Declaration and the onset of the British rule, Jewish immigration to Palestine began to increase, mainly due to the encouragement of Zionist organisations and support from the British government. This immigration was viewed positively by the Jewish community, but led to growing tensions with the Arab population, who feared the demographic and political implications of a growing Jewish presence. Many Arabs in Palestine opposed British control and the idea of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. They felt that the British were not honouring their promises of independence, which had been made during the war in exchange for support against the Ottomans. This resentment fueled growing Arab nationalism, leading to sporadic protests and demonstrations against British policies. What was the Nebi Musa riots? In April 1920, just before the official start of the British Mandate, tensions erupted into violence. The Nebi Musa riots, which took place in Jerusalem and spread to other parts of Palestine, were sparked by nationalist and religious sentiments. Arab mobs clashed with Jews, and there were attacks on Jewish neighbourhoods and properties. The British forces were unable to prevent the violence, and the riots highlighted the deepening divisions between Jews and Arabs. What was the Jaffa riots? The Jaffa riots of 1921 were a violent outbreak of Arab-Jewish conflict in the city of Jaffa, which was then part of British-controlled Palestine. The riots were sparked by a combination of local incidents and growing resentment. While there wasn't one specific event that set off the violence, tensions had been mounting over several years. What was the Hebron massacre? The 1929 Hebron massacre was a violent attack on the Jewish community in Hebron, a city in Palestine, during a period of growing tensions between Arabs and Jews. This event was part of a larger wave of violence known as the 1929 Arab riots, which affected multiple cities in Palestine, including Hebron. The massacre led to the deaths of 67 Jews and the destruction of Jewish properties and homes. When was the Arab Revolt? The Arab Revolt took place between 1936 and 1939 in Palestine and was an uprising against British colonial rule and Jewish immigration. It was the first large-scale organised rebellion by Palestinian Arabs against both the British authorities and the increasing presence of Jewish immigrants. What was the 1937 Peel Commission? The 1937 Peel Commission proposed the partition of Palestine into separate Jewish and Arab states, but was rejected by the Arab leadership. What was the 1939 British White Paper? The 1939 British White Paper was a policy that limited Jewish immigration to Palestine at a time when the Jewish people were facing increasing persecution in Nazi Germany. In response to the Arab Revolt and to appease Arab demands, the British government issued the White Paper, which drastically changed its policy towards Jewish immigration and land acquisition in Palestine. The White Paper limited Jewish immigration to 75,000 Jews over the next 5 years, from 1939 to 1944, and was a significant reduction in the number of Jewish immigrants allowed into Palestine, especially compared to previous years when Jewish immigration had been increasing in response to growing persecution in Nazi Germany. What happened after World War II? After 1944, no further Jewish immigration would be allowed unless the Arab majority in Palestine consented to it, giving the Arab population a veto over future Jewish immigration. What was the King David Hotel bombing? The King David Hotel bombing in 1946 was a significant and violent act carried out by a Jewish militant group against the British authorities in Palestine. The bombing was part of a larger campaign by Zionist underground groups to force Britain to end its mandate over Palestine and allow the establishment of a Jewish state. During the 1930s and 1940s, the Jewish underground groups engaged in violent resistance against British rule in response to the policies that limited Jewish immigration to Palestine and British support for Arab nationalist demands. The Holocaust had a significant impact on the situation as Jewish survivors of Nazi persecution sought refuge in Palestine. Britain, bound by its commitments under the 1939 White Paper, severely restricted Jewish immigration, which led to growing discontent within the Jewish community. The Zionist leadership, including the Jewish Agency, was frustrated by British restrictions and what they saw as Britain's failure to support the creation of a Jewish state. At the same time, Zionist militant groups adopted increasingly violent tactics in their efforts to force Britain to leave Palestine and allow for the establishment of a Jewish homeland. The Irgun, a Zionist militant group, argued that the British were actively obstructing the creation of a Jewish state, and their attacks were meant to bring attention to the issue and to undermine British authority in the region. The bombing symbolised the lengths to which the Irgun and other Jewish underground groups were willing to go to achieve their goals. For the Zionists, it was a bold act of resistance against British imperialism and a demonstration of their commitment to creating a Jewish state in Palestine. What was the 1947 UN Partition Plan? The 1947 UN Partition Plan was a plan which aimed to resolve the conflict between Jews and Arabs in Palestine by proposing the division of the land into separate Jewish and Arab states, with Jerusalem placed under international administration. Britain referred the issue of Palestine to the United Nations in 1947. The UN Special Committee on Palestine was formed to find a solution to the conflict. The plan called for the creation of two independent states, one Jewish and one Arab, to be established in Palestine. The Jewish state was to consist of 55% of the land, while the Arab state was to consist of 45%. The Jewish state was proposed to include the coastal plain, the Jezreel Valley, and much of the fertile land in the area. The Arab state would include areas such as the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which were seen as more sparsely populated and economically less developed compared to the coastal areas. Jerusalem was to be treated as an international city under UN administration. The plan recognized the city's significance to both Jews and Arabs, as well as Christians, and proposed that it not be part of either the Jewish or the Arab state. The plan anticipated some level of population exchanges between Jews and Arabs, with the idea of separating the populations to ensure the viability of the two states. In practice, this would have meant that Jewish communities living in Arab-majority areas would be relocated to the Jewish state and vice versa. The Jewish Agency, which represented the Zionist leadership, accepted the UN partition plan. The Jewish community in Palestine saw the plan as a historic opportunity to establish a Jewish state, even though it did not grant all of the land that the Zionist leaders had hoped for. While the Jewish leadership was deeply disappointed by the limitations of the plan, particularly the allocation of the majority of the lands to the Arabs, they understood that the plan was a compromise that could lay the foundation for a future Jewish state. The Jewish Agency agreed to the establishment of a Jewish state on the 55% of the land, which included much of the country's fertile areas. The Zionist movement viewed the establishment of a state, even on a smaller portion of the land, as a critical step toward the realization of the Jewish national dream. Arab leaders were strongly opposed to the partition plan. They argued that the plan was unjust and violated the rights of the Arab majority in Palestine. Arabs viewed the partition as a colonial imposition by the international community, which would give the majority of the land to the Jewish minority, who represented only around 30% of the population at the time. The Arab Higher Committee and the Arab League rejected the partition. They claimed that the plan violated their right to self-determination and sought to preserve Palestine as a unified Arab state. Arab states, including Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and Syria, supported the Palestinian Arabs' rejection of the partition and promised to assist them in resisting its implementation. What happened in 1947 when the UN General Assembly voted on the partition plan? On November the 29th, 1947, the UN General Assembly voted on the partition plan. The result was as follows. 33 votes were in favour, including the United States, the Soviet Union, and several Latin American and Eastern European countries. 13 votes were against, including all the Arab countries, along with India and Yugoslavia, and 10 countries abstained, including Britain, which had been administering Palestine under the mandate. The vote was a significant moment, marking the first time in history that an international body formally endorsed the creation of a Jewish state. The Jewish community celebrated the vote as a major victory, while the Arab states and the Arab League condemned it as a betrayal and a violation of their rights. How did the Arab states and Palestinian Arabs respond to the vote? Following the UN vote, the Jewish and Arab communities in Palestine entered into a period of intense civil conflict. The rejection of the partition plan by the Arab states and the Palestinian Arabs led to a civil war between Jewish and Arab communities in Palestine. Arab attacks on Jewish settlements and cities increased, and the Jewish militias began to respond with military force. Britain, facing escalating violence and pressure from both sides, announced that it would end its mandate and withdraw from Palestine by mid-1948. The British decision was influenced by growing unrest and violence, as well as the fact that Britain could no longer afford to maintain its control over the region. As violence between Jewish and Arabs intensified, the Jewish leadership began to take steps towards establishing the State of Israel. On May 14, 1948, just after the British withdrew, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel, based on the UN partition plan, even though the Arab states had rejected it. The declaration of the State of Israel was immediately followed by the invasion of the new state by neighbouring Arab countries, marking the start of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, also known as the War of Independence. The war was fought between the newly established State of Israel and a coalition of 5 Arab countries, including Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, along with Palestinian Arab forces. The war ended in Israeli victory in the sense that it led to the establishment of the State of Israel. Israel's territory was expanded beyond the borders set by the UN partition plan. The Arab states, which had aimed to prevent the creation of Israel, were militarily defeated. Jordan and Egypt occupied large portions of Palestinian land but were unable to dislodge Israeli forces. Arab nations suffered both military losses and political embarrassment. Over 700,000 Palestinian Arabs were displaced or forced to flee their homes during and after the war, creating a refugee crisis that persists to this day. Many of these refugees fled to neighbouring Arab countries or to areas like the West Bank and Gaza Strip, which were later occupied by Jordan and Egypt. Jerusalem became a divided city, with West Jerusalem under Israeli control and East Jerusalem, including the Old City, controlled by Jordan. The war ended in 1949 with Israeli in control of more territory than was originally allocated by the UN partition plan, and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced, leading to the long-standing Palestinian refugee crisis. What was the 1950 Palestinian Right of Return Law? The 1950 Palestinian Right of Return Law relates to the Palestinian refugee crisis that resulted from the war. Many of them fled to neighbouring Arab countries such as Jordan, Lebanon, Syria and Egypt, while others ended up in the West Bank or Gaza Strip. The Palestinian refugees and their descendants, who now number in the millions, have continued to live in refugee camps or in diaspora, with many advocating for the right of return to their ancestral homes in what is now Israel. What was the UNRWA? In December 1949, the United Nations General Assembly established the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East. The agency was created to provide humanitarian aid to Palestinian refugees and to help with their basic needs. As part of its mandate, the UNRWA worked on reintegration programs for refugees, including the potential for them to return to their homes in Israel, though no actual right of return was formalised in the agency's actions. Israel strongly opposed the implementation of the right of return, arguing that the return of large numbers of Palestinian refugees would undermine the Jewish character of the state and lead to demographic changes that would threaten its existence. What was the 1950 Law of Return? The 1950 Law of Return granted Jews worldwide the right to immigrate to Israel and acquire Israeli citizenship, regardless of where they were born or where they lived. This law became a central tenet of Israel's identity as the homeland for Jews, ensuring that Jews facing persecution or discrimination around the world could find refuge in Israel. It had a significant impact on the demographics of the country, bringing in large waves of immigrants from Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, and other regions. The law, however, has also been a point of contention, particularly in relation to its definition of Jewishness and its exclusion of Palestinian refugees. Who assassinated King Abdullah I in 1951? In 1951, King Abdullah I was assassinated. It was carried out by a Palestinian nationalist who opposed the king's moderate approach towards Israel. King Abdullah had sought to secure peace with Israel and maintain Jordan's stability, but his willingness to negotiate was seen as a betrayal by Palestinian nationalists and some Arab leaders. The assassination of King Abdullah also had repercussions in the broader Arab world. While some Arab leaders shared Abdullah's views on peace with Israel, many others, especially those who were more anti-Israel or anti-Western, saw his death as a symbolic victory for their stance. The event further complicated the already fractured Arab world and relations between various Arab nations and factions. What is the PLO? The founding of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, in 1964 was established with the aim of representing the Palestinian people and pursuing their goal of creating an independent Palestinian state. Although the PLO's tactics led to significant violence and a rejection of Israel's existence, over time it became recognized as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. The PLO's approach would evolve from armed resistance to diplomatic engagement, culminating in the Oslo Accords of 1993, which marked a shift towards a negotiated peace process with Israel. What was the Six-Day War of 1967? The Six-Day War of 1967, involving Israel and a coalition of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, resulted in an Israeli victory and had a profound impact on the political landscape of the region. Israel dramatically expanded its territory following the war, occupying the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza Strip, Sinai Peninsula, and Golan Heights. The West Bank and Gaza Strip, previously under Jordanian and Egyptian control, were now under Israeli occupation. Arab states were humiliated by their swift defeat, and the Arab-Israeli conflict entered a new phase. Despite losing the war, many Arab countries rallied around the idea of liberating the territories Israel had occupied. Although Israel captured the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, it later returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in the 1979 Camp David Accords as part of a peace agreement. The Gaza Strip, however, remained under Israeli occupation until 2005, when Israel unilaterally disengaged. Israel retained control over the Golan Heights, despite Syria's repeated demands for its return. The Golan Heights remains a strategically vital region for Israel, and its status is still disputed by Syria. Israel's victory reshaped the borders of the region, left Israel in control of significant Palestinian territories, and deepened the Arab-Israeli conflict. How did Egypt respond to the capturing of the Sinai Peninsula after the Six-Day War? After Israel's victory in the 1967 Six-Day War, it occupied Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, including the east bank of the Suez Canal. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser refused to accept Israel's control over Sinai and aimed to wear down Israeli forces through a prolonged war of attrition, a strategy intended to make the occupation too costly for Israel to sustain. The 1969 to 1970 War of Attrition was an intense, drawn-out conflict between Egypt and Israel, characterized by artillery battles, airstrikes, and Soviet involvement. While Israel maintained control of Sinai, Egypt used the war to prepare for a larger confrontation, which would come in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War. What was the 1969 Al-Aqsa Mosque arson incident? The 1969 Al-Aqsa Mosque arson incident involved the burning of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, one of Islam's holiest sites located in East Jerusalem, which was under Israeli occupation following the 1967 Six-Day War. The fire was set by an Australian extremist named Michael Dennis Rohan, a Christian who had come to Jerusalem under the pretense of being a tourist. Rohan was a member of a radical Christian group, and his motivations were rooted in his belief in apocalyptic prophecies that were linked to the end of times and the idea of rebuilding a Jewish temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The fire intensified tensions between Israelis and Palestinians, with the mosque becoming a symbol of the broader conflict over Jerusalem. What does Black September refer to? Black September refers to a violent conflict between Jordan and the Palestine Liberation Organization in 1970. After a series of hijackings and escalating tensions between the PLO and the Jordanian government, the Jordanian military launched a violent crackdown against Palestinian militants in Jordan, resulting in the deaths of around 3,500 Palestinians. The conflict led to the expulsion of the PLO from Jordan and marked a major shift in the Palestinian struggle, as the PLO relocated to Lebanon, where it would continue its operations and involvements in regional conflicts. The Palestinian militant group Black September was a radical faction of the PLO, formed after the 1970 Black September conflict. The group sought revenge against Israel and international attention for the Palestinian cause. What happened in the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich? The Palestinian terrorist group Black September carried out a hostage-taking and murder of 11 Israeli athletes and coaches during the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich, West Germany. With the Munich Olympics being a highly publicized global event, Black September saw it as an opportunity to strike against Israel on an international stage. After a failed German rescue attempt, all 11 hostages were killed. Israel responded with Operation Wrath of God, assassinating the masterminds behind the attack. What was the Yom Kippur War? The Yom Kippur War, also known as the October War or Ramadan War, was a surprise military offensive launched by Egypt and Syria against Israel on October 6, 1973, during the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur and the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. The war lasted for 19 days, and although Israel ultimately repelled the attacks, it suffered heavy losses and was caught off guard. Despite early Arab gains, Israel counterattacked, eventually encircling Egyptian forces and pushing into Syria. The war led to US-brokered peace talks, culminating in the 1978 Camp David Accords, where Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. What was the Land Day protest? The Land Day protest on March 30th, 1976, was a major Palestinian protest against Israeli land confiscation, primarily in the Galilee region. The demonstrations were met with violent repression, leading to 6 Palestinian citizens of Israel being killed by Israeli security forces. What was the Camp David Accord? The Camp David Accords were a historic peace agreement between Egypt and Israel, brokered by US President Jimmy Carter in September 1978. This led to the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab nation and resulted in Israel's withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula. The 1978 Camp David Accords resulted in Egypt recognizing Israel and marked the first peace agreement between Israel and an Arab nation. While it ended Egypt-Israel hostilities, the promised Palestinian autonomy never materialized. What was the 1982 Lebanon War? The 1982 Lebanon War was an Israeli military invasion of Lebanon aimed at expelling the PLO, which was launching attacks on Israel from Lebanese territory. The 1982 Lebanon War led to the siege of Beirut and the Sabra and Shatila massacre, where Israel-backed Christian militias killed thousands of Palestinian refugees. The war sparked massive protests in Israel, led to the British rise of Hezbollah, and resulted in Israel's long-term entanglement in Lebanon until 2000. What was Operation Wooden Leg? On October 1st, 1985, Israel launched Operation Wooden Leg, an airstrike on the Palestine Liberation Organization headquarters in Tunisia, killing around 60 people. The attack was meant to retaliate against the PLO-linked terrorist attack in Cyprus and to demonstrate Israel's capability to strike PLO leadership even outside the Middle East. Did the PLO ever recognize Israel's right to exist? In 1988, the PLO made a historic shift by recognizing Israel's right to exist and renounced terrorism. This was a major turning point in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as the PLO had long been committed to Israel's destruction. In 1988, the PLO recognized Israel, renounced terrorism, and declared a Palestinian state. This led to US PLO negotiations, but was met with Israeli skepticism. It marked the beginning of diplomatic engagement between Palestinians and the international community, setting the stage for the Oslo peace process. What was the first Intifada? The first Intifada was a mass Palestinian uprising between the years 1987 to 1993 against Israeli military occupation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. It began as a grassroots revolt but later led to armed confrontations and diplomatic shifts, ultimately paving the way for the Oslo Accords in 1993. Uprising was marked by protests, clashes and Israeli crackdowns. It led to Hamas's rise and ultimately forced peace talks, though long-term peace remained elusive. What was the Oslo Accords? The Oslo Accords in 1993 were a historic agreement between Israel and the PLO that laid the groundwork for limited Palestinian self-rule in parts of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The Accords marked the first formal mutual recognition between Israel and the PLO and were intended as a step towards a two-state solution. Despite hopes for peace, violence, Israeli settlement expansion, and political opposition eventually stalled the process, preventing a final peace deal. When was the Second Intifada? The Second Intifada, also known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada, was a period of intensified Israeli-Palestinian violence that began in late September 2000 and lasted until around 2005, though it had lingering effects well beyond that period. The Second Intifada had lasting consequences, contributing to deepening divisions, increasing distrust, and the eventual shift in political strategy on both sides. It also marked a turning point in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, with the idea of a negotiated two-state solution becoming increasingly distant for many. What was the Camp David Summit? The 2000 Camp David Summit was a critical, yet ultimately unsuccessful, attempt to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It took place from July 11th to July the 25th, 2000, at the Camp David retreat in Maryland, USA, under the auspices of US President Bill Clinton. The summit aimed to achieve a final status agreement between Israel and the Palestinians, but it ended in failure, and the aftermath was marked by increased violence in the region. In retrospect, the 2000 Camp David Summit is seen as a missed opportunity in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Despite the concessions made by Israel, the failure to address the core issues and the intractable positions of both sides meant that the peace remained elusive. When was the West Bank separation barrier constructed? In 2002, Israel began constructing the West Bank separation barrier, also referred to as the security fence, a major infrastructure project designed to separate Israeli territory from Palestinian areas in the West Bank. The barrier was built as a response to a wave of suicide bombings and terrorist attacks carried out by Palestinian militants during the Second Intifada from year 2000 to 2005. In summary, the 2002 construction of Israel's West Bank separation barrier was a direct response to escalating violence during the Second Intifada. While it provided significant security benefits to Israel, it also deepened the divide between Israelis and Palestinians, exacerbated tensions, and contributed to the failure of peace efforts. When did Israel withdraw from the Gaza Strip? In 2005, Israel carried out a unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip under the plan known as Disengagement Plan, implemented by then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon. This withdrawal marked a significant shift in Israel's policy towards the Gaza Strip, but it ultimately led to unforeseen political and security consequences. Israel's 2002 withdrawal from Gaza, though intended to improve security and ease tensions, ultimately led to Hamas's rise to power and the political fragmentation of the Palestinian territories. What was the 2006 Lebanon War? The 2006 Lebanon War, also known as the Second Lebanon War, was a military conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, a Shiite militant group based in southern Lebanon. The war lasted for 34 days from July the 12th to August the 14th, 2006, and it was sparked by Hezbollah's actions but had broader implications for the region. The 2006 Lebanon War was a conflict that saw Israel and Hezbollah's fighting to achieve their respective objectives. While the war ended in a ceasefire, neither side fully achieved its goals. Hezbollah emerged with enhanced political legitimacy, while Israel faced criticism over its handling of the conflict. When did Hamas win the Palestinian elections? In 2006, Hamas won the Palestinian legislative elections. Hamas's victory in the 2006 Palestinian elections led to the split between Hamas and Fatah, resulting in Hamas taking control of Gaza in 2007 and Fatah controlling the West Bank. How did Hamas take control of the Gaza Strip? In 2007, Hamas seized control of the Gaza Strip after a violent conflict with Fatah, the dominant Palestinian faction in the West Bank. This event, often referred to as the Hamas takeover of Gaza, had significant political, humanitarian, and security implications. The 2007 Hamas takeover of Gaza resulted in the complete political and territorial division of the Palestinian authorities, with Hamas controlling Gaza and Fatah controlling the West Bank. What was the Gaza War? The 2008 to 2009 Gaza War, also known as Operation Cast Lead, was a military conflict between Israel and Hamas that took place between December the 27th, 2008 and January the 18th, 2009. It was launched by Israel with the stated objective of halting rocket fire from the Gaza Strip into southern Israel and weakening Hamas's military capabilities. The 2008 to 2009 Gaza War was a violent and destructive conflict between Israel and Hamas, triggered by increased rocket fire from Gaza into Israel. Israel's goal was to stop the rocket attacks and weaken Hamas, but the war led to high civilian casualties, extensive damage to Gaza, and an ongoing humanitarian crisis. The ceasefire left both sides entrenched in their positions, with sporadic violence continuing in the years that followed. Did Palestine gain full membership as a sovereign state by the UN? In 2011, Palestine made a significant diplomatic move at the United Nations, seeking full membership as a sovereign state despite strong opposition from Israel and the United States. Although it did not achieve full membership at the time, it did successfully gain non-member observer state status, a significant step forward in its pursuit of international recognition. What was the Israel-Gaza War? The 2014 Israel-Gaza War, also known as Operation Protective Edge, was a 7-week conflict that erupted between Israel and Hamas, the Palestinian militant group that controls the Gaza Strip. The war had devastating humanitarian consequences and caused significant casualties on both sides, especially among Palestinian civilians. The 2014 Gaza War was a deadly and destructive conflict triggered by escalating tensions and rocket fire from Gaza. The war led to significant casualties, particularly among Palestinian civilians, and caused widespread destruction in Gaza. Despite multiple ceasefire attempts, the conflict ended without addressing the underlying issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, such as the blockade on Gaza, the political division between Hamas and Fatah, and the broader peace process. When did the US Embassy move from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem? In 2017, President Donald Trump made a highly controversial decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and move the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. The decision was widely condemned by Palestinians, Arab countries, and much of the internal community, with many arguing it would undermine the peace process and increase tensions in the region. The embassy opening in 2018 was accompanied by violent protests and casualties, especially in Gaza. Where were the Gaza protests? The 2018 to 2019 Gaza protests, known as the Great March of Return, were a series of mass protests led by Palestinians along the Gaza-Israel border. The protests began on March the 30th, 2018, and continued for more than a year, resulting in significant violence, particularly from the Israeli military, as well as high Palestinian casualties. The 2018 to 2019 Gaza protests were a series of mass demonstrations by Palestinians calling for an end to the blockade on Gaza and for the right of return of Palestinian refugees. The protests led to violent clashes, with the Israeli military using live ammunition to disperse the crowds, resulting in high Palestinian casualties. The protests highlighted the dire humanitarian conditions in Gaza and the ongoing frustration with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The use of force by Israel was widely criticised by the international community, but it was justified by Israel as necessary for security. The protests brought global attention to the Palestinian plight, but did not result in significant changes to the political situation or the conditions in Gaza. What is the Abraham Accords? The 2020 Abraham Accords were a significant diplomatic breakthrough in the Middle East, marking a series of normalization agreements between Israel and several Arab countries. These agreements, brokered by the United States, established formal ties between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. The Accords were named after the biblical figure Abraham, a patriarch shared by Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, symbolizing cooperation and peace among the Abrahamic faiths. While the Accords were hailed as a diplomatic success by many, they were also met with criticism, particularly from the Palestinians, who viewed the deals as a betrayal of their cause. What was the Israel-Gaza conflict? The 2021 Israel-Gaza conflict, which lasted for 11 days in May, erupted following a series of escalating events in Jerusalem, particularly around the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound and the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. The 2021 Gaza conflict began after escalating tensions in Jerusalem, particularly in Al-Aqsa Mosque and Sheikh Jarrah, led to Hamas launching rockets at Israel. Israel responded with airstrikes, and the conflict lasted for 11 days in May, resulting in heavy casualties, particularly among Palestinians in Gaza. The conflict ended with a ceasefire, but underlying issues such as the status of Jerusalem, Palestinian rights, and the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict remained unresolved. When was Israel's far-right coalition government formed? In 2022, Benjamin Netanyahu formed a far-right coalition government in Israel, which became one of the most right-wing administrations in the country's history. This government was marked by a shift towards nationalist and religious policies, leading to increased tensions, particularly over the issue of Israeli settlements in the West Bank and the status of Palestinian territories. The formation of Netanyahu's 2022 far-right coalition led to a significant shift in Israeli politics, with increased support for settlement expansion and a more hardline approach towards Palestinians. The coalition's policies sparked widespread protests and international criticism, especially from those concerned about the undermining of Palestinian rights and the two-state solution. The new government's approach deepened existing tensions in the West Bank and Gaza, contributing to a volatile political environment in Israel and the Palestinian territories. What happened on October the 7th? On October the 7th, 2023, Hamas launched a large-scale and coordinated attack on Israel, marking a major escalation in the ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestinian groups. The attack began with a massive barrage of rockets fired from Gaza into Israel, targeting cities including Tel Aviv, Ashkelon, and Beersheba. This was accompanied by a ground assault, with Hamas militants infiltrating southern Israel, attacking civilian areas and overrunning military positions. The attackers used a combination of tactics, including paragliders to breach Israeli airspace, making the assault particularly unexpected and deadly. The attack initiated an ongoing conflict that has caused significant loss of life on both sides. The situation remains highly volatile, with Israel conducting extensive military operations to eliminate Hamas's capabilities, while Hamas continues to launch rocket attacks and carry out other forms of resistance. The violence has drawn sharp international focus, and there are growing concerns over the humanitarian impact in Gaza. In 2023, Israel faced significant internal political turmoil due to a controversial judicial reform plan spearheaded by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his far-right coalition government. The reform aimed to limit the power of Israel's Supreme Court and shift the balance of power within Israel's judicial system, and it sparked widespread protests across the country. The 2023 judicial reform protests led to a deepening political crisis in Israel, with widespread public opposition to the proposed changes to the judicial system. While Netanyahu's government stood firm on the reforms, the scale of the protests, the internal divisions they exposed, and the pressure from the military, economy, and international community forced the government to reconsider certain aspects of the plan. The crisis highlighted broader tensions in Israeli society over issues of democracy, judicial independence, and the future direction of the country under Netanyahu's leadership. In the aftermath of 2023, the Israel-Palestine conflict remains as volatile as ever. The October 7th, 2023 Hamas attack marks an intense military escalation that worsened the humanitarian situation and entrenched divisions between the two sides. At the same time, internal Israeli political struggles and international diplomacy remain critical factors in shaping the trajectory of the conflict. While some shifts, like the Abraham Accords and growing Arab cooperation with Israel, offer potential openings for dialogue, the ongoing violence, settlement expansion, and lack of progress on a political solution continue to fuel the conflict in a largely negative direction. Since the conflict escalated on October 7th, 2023, according to reports, at least 50,021 Palestinians have been killed, with 113,274 wounded as of March 2025. On the Israeli side, approximately 1,200 Israelis have lost their lives, with 5,431 injured during the same period. These figures highlight the profound human toll the conflict has taken on both communities. A lot of non-religious people feel that the conflict in Israel and Palestine vindicates their thoughts about the death and violence that religion can precipitate. What's going on here is not a question of being right or wrong, but a question of ethics, which is why the topic can be so divisive. I hope this episode can give you a more informed opinion on the conflict, and be sure to stay tuned for more informative and stimulating episodes like this one. Thanks for listening.